Spring 1944. Into the clear blue above the Himalayan foothills, a new silhouette came into combat, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the heaviest and most advanced piston-bombing aircraft yet built by the United States, now deployed for the first time in earnest against Japan. Designed from the outset for very high-altitude operation above 30,000 feet, it embodied a philosophy: fly where the enemy cannot reach, deliver destruction from a height of safety, and so force the war onto terms the Japanese could not meet. From the steel and rivet drawings, the B-29's altitude capability drove everything: turbocharged Wright R3000, 350 engines, a pressurized crew cabin, vast wings laden with fuel, and remote-controlled defensive turrets. Its service ceiling hovered close to 32,000 feet or more. Wikipedia. In contrast, Japanese escort or home defense fighters, Ki-61 Hien, Ki-45 Toryū, and others, simply lacked climb or high-altitude performance. Wikipedia. As the spring of '44 passed into summer, Allied strategists concluded that to bring the Japanese home islands within bombing range, one needed two things: bases in China or India, and bombers capable of reaching them and returning. The China-Burma-India route placed the B-29 at the very edge of its operational envelope. On June 15 to 16, 1944, from forward bases near Chengdu in China, the XX Bomber Command launched its first raid on the home islands, a nocturnal strike against the steelworks at Yawata, Kyushu. Wikipedia. On the Japanese side, radars and searchlights flickered to life in the late evening of 15 June. A radar picket offshore reported aircraft inbound around 2331 local time. Wikipedia. The air defense controllers of the Japanese 19th Air Brigade, charged with defending Kyushu, scrambled fighters, but their machines struggled. The night fighters available were few. The Ki-45 Toryū heavy fighters could reach maybe 25,000, 26,000 feet in ideal conditions. The single-engine Ki-61 fared worse at high altitude. They simply could not reliably intercept bombers operating above them. At around 0038, the B-29 seconds began their bomb run. Many flew above 28,000, 30,000 feet, some at or above 32,000 feet. Many Japanese pilots peered up through canopy glass into thinning air, watching contrails, shadowy silhouettes drifting high overhead unreachable. What the defenders saw through their instruments: radar blips climbing higher than they expected, tracks that faded into the stratosphere, produced a growing sense of frustration. They could see the bombers, but their aircraft could not climb fast enough, not far enough, and not with the sustained performance they needed. Some searchlight shafts reached into the night sky, fighters floated upward, but at 2830 kf, the Japanese machines began to fall off performance. Their engines lost power, oxygen supply faltered, maneuverability dwindled. Meanwhile, the B-29 crews felt the opposite. High above the flak and fighters, the air cooled, the machines trimmed into formation, the defensive turrets poised to ward off any rare attacker. In practice, what this meant was more than altitude numbers. The Americans could fly bombing missions from forward Chinese airfields to Yawata, a round trip of about 1,600 miles, and return. Japanese fighters, based on the home islands, lacked both the reach and the sustained climb to engage them effectively at altitude. The June raid exemplified this. Of the 75 B-29 seconds that attempted the mission, only 47 reached the target, but of these, only 2 were lost to Japanese fighters. The others fell to mechanical or flak causes. Wikipedia. The Japanese radar units later admitted their altimeter readings were unreliable. They could detect inbound bombers on screens, but had little ability to determine altitude or vector intercepts at 30,000 feet. Wikipedia. For the Japanese interceptor pilots, the physical sensation must have been wrenching. They climbed and climbed, their air masks fogging, engine vibrations rising, but still the bomber stream floated serenely above them. They watched bombs fall, heard explosions in the distance, and yet could not close. In one post-war memoir, A Japanese pilot described seeing B-29 seconds, silhouettes drifting above the searchlights, too high, too slow for us to reach or engage. That altitude gap became psychological as well as tactical. The defenders realized they were fighting an enemy whose airframe and operational philosophy placed the war at heights they could not hope to contest. From the American side, for the crews of the Superfortress, the altitude provided both advantage and challenge. The thinner air reduced drag but demanded engine management and oxygen systems. Navigation over long distances through China's airfields and over the Yellow Sea required precision. When the targets came in view at night over Kyushu, clouds and smoke layer between 26-30 K forced many bombers to rely on radar bombing rather than visual aiming. Only 15 of the 47 bombers dropped visually. Wikipedia. But the essence remained. The B-29 held its altitude, and the defenders often did not. Thus, when the Japanese nonetheless tried to engage, the whole doctrine of interception was undermined. Speed and climb, two hallmarks of dogfighting aircraft, were eroded at high altitude. Japanese fighters' rate of climb fell sharply. For example, a Ki-61's performance above 25,000 feet was so degraded that it struggled to stay in formation with bomber streams or intercept them. The Ki-45 Toryū heavy fighter, though better in theory, suffered engine limitations and lacked radar or effective night equipment. The result: high-altitude B-29 raids brought bomber crews into Japanese skies with relative impunity, especially initially. Japanese radar warnings came late, scramble times were protracted, altitude margins favored the bomber. The design logic of the B-29 had thus been vindicated. By operating in thin air, near 30,000 feet, it placed itself in a stratum of the sky that the enemy couldn't reliably contest. Its bomb load, its range, its industrial scale of production had all been calibrated to this requirement. The fact that many enemy fighters simply could not reach that altitude, or if they did, could not fight effectively, there became a force multiplier in itself. Altitude served not only as physical distance but as protective bubble. The Japanese defenders realized, with increasing dismay, that they were chasing shadows above their effective envelope. For the men on the ground at Yawata, or the controllers watching radars flicker in Fukuoka Prefecture, the June night meant recognition of a new reality. The war had ascended beyond the traditional fight. The bomber had turned altitude into an offensive tool. For the defending Japanese Air Force and Army, the implication was stark. Their fighter hardware and doctrine were being superseded, not simply challenged but outrun. The height at which the B-29 cruised was no longer a battleground. It was dominion. And in the quiet respiration of its turbocharged engines, the bomber whispered the eventual outcome. In industrial war, superior machines, production scale, and operational envelope mattered perhaps as much as tactics or pilots. The thin air where the Superfortress cruised, and where Japanese interceptors failed to follow, became a battlefield of its own. And at that altitude the war changed. The 15th of June, 1944. The humid summer air over Kyushu trembled with the faint, unfamiliar hum of four-engined aircraft long before any searchlight touched them. To the men of Japan's Fourth Air Army, the warning came as scattered reports, radar plots from Moji, an uneasy telephone call from a picket ship off Iki Island, then silence. The intercept network, stretched thin after years of war, knew something extraordinary was coming, an attack from a direction and altitude beyond precedent. At 11:30 p.m., operators at the Yawata Defense Command Center saw the first high-altitude echoes on their plotting boards. They were steady, slow, and too high above 30,000 feet, possibly 32,000. Colonel Shigeyoshi Nakamura, commander of the Kyushu sector, ordered every available interceptor airborne. From Fukuoka and Omura, Ki-45 Toryū night fighters scrambled, engines coughing in the warm, wet air. Minutes later, a handful of Ki-61 Hien fighters followed, stripped of excess weight and carrying half fuel to claw for altitude. The men inside their cramped cockpits were among Japan's most seasoned defenders, but none had ever fought so high, nor against machines of such scale. As the Japanese fighters rose through haze and thin cirrus, their altimeters wound past 24,000 feet, then 26,000. The oxygen flow hissed, frost formed around mask valves. At 28,000 feet, the engines began to labor, losing manifold pressure as superchargers struggled in the rare air. From that height, the pilots could already see thin contrails etched far above them, running in straight lines across the moonlit sky. They strained to climb another 1,000 feet, then another. At 30,000 feet, controls felt heavy, the cockpit thermometer registered near freezing, and still the American bombers hung higher. No amount of throttle coaxing could bridge the gulf. Up there, the B-29 Superfortresses of Brigadier General Kenneth Wolfe's XX Bomber Command droned on toward the Yawata steelworks. They had taken off from forward bases around Chengdu in the early evening, staged through India days earlier, and now cruised at altitudes between 28,000 and 33,000 feet. The aircraft carried 500-pound GP bombs and incendiary clusters, the first ever to target the Japanese home islands since the Doolittle raid 2 years before. Their gunners peered into the darkness through plexiglass bubbles, the temperature outside 40 degrees below zero, scanning for attackers that seldom appeared. On the ground, the Yawata anti-aircraft network responded with urgency, but confusion. Flak crews elevated barrels to impossible angles. Predictors struggled to calculate lead on targets at heights, their analog computers barely accommodated. The first bursts detonated thousands of feet too low, illuminating nothing but drifting haze. By midnight, the sky above northern Kyushu glittered with hundreds of searchlight beams, but most never reached the altitude of the intruders. When the bombers opened their bays, the defenders below heard only the faint rumble of distant engines. Then, moments later, the slow-rolling thunder of explosions around the Imperial Steelworks complex. In the Japanese fighter sector, frustration became disbelief. Captain Masao Kume of the 4th Sentai later recalled in interrogation, "We could see the flashes above, like stars exploding, but we could not close. At 30,000, the Hien no longer climbs. The engine gasps as a man suffocates. The Ki-45 crews fared no better. Their twin Nakajima Ha-102 engines produced good power at medium altitude, but above 27,000 feet the mixture thinned, the propellers bit empty air, and the heavy airframes wallowed. A few gunners fired bursts at fleeting shadows far beyond effective range. Not a single B-29 was confirmed destroyed by fighter action that night. For the Americans, the raid was a trial by fire rather than triumph. Weather, navigation errors, and engine failures scattered the formation long before they reached target. Of 75 B-29 seconds dispatched, 47 reached Yawata. Only 15 bombed visually, the rest by radar through cloud. One aircraft crashed in China, another was lost to flak, and several turned back with overheating engines, a chronic problem of the Wright R-3000-350 Cyclone. Yet, despite the mechanical misfortunes, the strategic message was unmistakable. Japan's interior was now vulnerable, and her air defenses impotent above the stratosphere. Radar operators at the Moji Coastal Station later analyzed their recordings. The traces had entered detection range at 35,000 feet beyond the effective ceiling of most interceptors. Controllers concluded that to engage the new American bombers would require either radical engine improvements or completely new fighters. In Tokyo, staff officers in the Army Air Technical Bureau studied the data with alarm, recommending immediate acceleration of the Ki-84 and J-2M Raiden programs, yet even those advanced types would barely touch 35,000 feet and only for minutes. Among the crews of the returning Superfortresses, the mood mixed exhaustion with awe. Many had flown 9-hour missions through monsoon turbulence and icing over the Himalayas, yet at 30,000 feet above Yawata, they had witnessed a phenomenon rare in any war, a target nation defenseless, not through lack of courage, but through physics. Sergeant James Lynch, a tail gunner of the 468th Group, wrote in his debriefing, "I saw fighters below us, tiny sparks climbing, then falling away. They looked like they hit a ceiling of glass." Japanese civilian witnesses confirmed the eerie scene. Residents near the steelworks reported hearing a low humming, like wind through wires, then a pause, then the impact of bombs. Few saw the aircraft themselves. Most stared upward into a sky where pinpoint flashes winked beyond reach. The defenders' inability to touch the intruders weighed heavily on morale. In later years, historian Toshio Fujimoto described it as the night Japan realized altitude could be an empire. By dawn on June 16th, the B-29 seconds were gone, sweeping back toward China over a storm-torn East China Sea. The fires at Yawata smoldered fitfully. Damage to production was modest, but the psychological impact immense. The Home Island Defense Command convened an emergency review. Their conclusion, preserved in captured war diaries, read simply, "Our fighters reached 9,000 meters, 29,500 feet. Enemy altitude, 10,000 meters, 32,800 feet. We could not intercept." For the American command in India, the mission was hailed as the first step in a new strategic phase. For Japanese officers reading the same altitudes on their charts, it was an omen. They had faced enemies superior in numbers before, but never one who fought from a realm of air they physically could not enter. That realization, born over Yawata's burning mills, marked the beginning of a long, helpless struggle against the sky itself. By late summer 1944, the sky over the home islands had become a mirror of Japan's predicament, clear, high, and impossibly out of reach. The enemy no longer came as the dive-bombing raids of China or the carrier strikes of 1942. He came in shimmering lines of silver at altitudes that defied pursuit. The B-29 Superfortress had turned the thin upper air into its fortress wall, and Japanese fighter pilots were discovering that even courage could not climb that high. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force responded first. The 47th Sentai, newly equipped with Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki Tojo Interceptors, was stationed near Tokyo, with orders to engage the intruders at any cost. On paper, the Ki-44 Hei could reach 10,500 meters, 34,400 feet, with its supercharged Ha-109 engine. In practice, the climb rate collapsed above 28,000 feet. Pilots flew stripped of armor and radio sets to save kilograms. Yet even then the aircraft shuddered and lost power in the climb. Lieutenant Hiroshi Kikuchi, whose combat report survives in captured documents, described his attempt to reach a B-29 stream over Nagoya. "I saw their contrails hanging like white bridges. I climbed until the engine coughed and the wings trembled. The altimeter showed 9,000 meters. They were still 1,000 above. I fired 2 bursts and the guns froze. Then I fell away like a stone." At the same time, the Navy's own interceptor, the Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden Jack, entered service with the 302nd Kokutai, near Yokosuka. It was built for high-altitude work, its Kasei 23A engine driven by a 2-stage mechanical supercharger. But the complexity of the system and Japan's deteriorating fuel quality made reliability elusive. Pilots joked that a Raiden could reach 35,000 feet once before its engine quit. In the first interceptions of B-29 seconds over Kyushu in August 1944, half the defending Raidens turned back with overheating or turbo failure before firing a shot. The problem was not courage, but physics. As the War Diary of the 4th Air Army noted on August 21, "Our fighters can climb but cannot fight. Above 9,000 meters, oxygen is insufficient, visibility poor, control stiff. Enemy bombers cruise smoothly and fire from turrets with radar-directed accuracy. The Americans' General Electric turbo superchargers maintained sea-level manifold pressure even in the stratosphere. Japanese engines, lacking such turbines, lost 30% of output in the same air. Thus the gap widened from altitude into annihilation. Desperation bred improvisation. The Air Technical Arsenal ordered Ki-45 Toryū heavy fighters, modified with 37mm and 75mm cannons to engage from below, firing upward into bomber formations. It was a noble concept, borrowed from German night fighter tactics, but nearly impossible to execute. The heavy guns further crippled climb rate, and aiming through the glare of searchlights proved futile. In one-night engagement over Osaka, Captain Masaru Tamai fired his 75mm Ho 401 cannon once the recoil jammed the mount and the flash blinded both crewmen. They returned, claiming a probable, but the American loss records show none. By autumn 1944, the phrase Tayatari body attack entered operational vocabulary. Ramming units, officially the Shinten Seikutai, heaven-shaking air superiority units, were formed from volunteers. They were told that the B-29's armor was vulnerable at the wings and tail. A glancing strike might sever a control surface and allow the pilot to bail out. Reality was grimmer. At 30,000 feet, any collision meant instant disintegration for both machines. Between November 1944 and February 1945, 25 Shinten Seikutai sorties were launched. Only 6 B-29 seconds were confirmed downed. The rest ended as white puffs high above the clouds, tragedies invisible from the ground. Each interception became a ritual of futility. Radar operators in Kanto or Kyushu would call enemy, 10 kilometers altitude, course 270. Engines coughed to life. Fighters clawed upward through layered haze. At 25,000 feet, the oxygen hissed. At 28,000 feet, the guns froze with condensation. At 30,000 feet, the horizon blurred into grey. Then, from even higher, small black dots released silver rain bombs tumbling through the tropopause, and the chase was over. Pilots gliding home on idle power could still see the B-29 seconds above, shrinking westward into the sun. The 10th Air Division's after-action report for October 24 summed up the month with bureaucratic brevity. Intercepted 12 raids, engaged 7, claims 1 probable, losses 23 aircraft, primary cause, insufficient climb performance. A margin note by Colonel Tachibana, later captured at Clark Field, added more bluntly, "The enemy fights from a world we cannot enter." For the pilots themselves, the experience carried physical torment. Without pressurization, cockpit temperature at 30,000 feet fell below 40 degrees Celsius. Frost formed on instruments, exposed skin stuck to metal. The primitive oxygen regulators often failed, causing dizziness or blackout. Many sorties ended not in combat but in hypoxia. Mechanic Katsuo Takigawa remembered watching fighters land with pilots slumped over the stick, faces blue, eyes open but blind. Yet amid this despair, a strange respect grew. Japanese flyers began calling the B-29 Tenku no Ki, the Sky Fortress. They marveled that its guns fired by remote sight, its engines stayed cool, its crews breathed warm air. They envied its abundance of everything Japan now lacked: fuel, oxygen, insulation, aluminum, spare parts. The aircraft seemed less an enemy than an embodiment of another civilization's industrial reach. The contrast could be measured in metal. By September 1944, American factories had delivered more than 500 B-29 seconds. Japan had built barely 100 Raidens and fewer than 200 high-altitude Shokis. The arithmetic of production mirrored that of altitude, one nation ascending, the other gasping. When the B-29 seconds struck Anshan and Omura in October, Japanese controllers stopped giving altitude estimates to avoid demoralizing their pilots. The official communiqué read only, "Enemy heavy bombers sighted. All units scramble." Everyone knew what that meant. Another climb to nowhere, another fight fought vertically until the air ran out. By the end of 1944, the sky above Japan had become a domain of humiliation. The fighters rose bravely, flamed briefly, and fell. The bombers cruised home untouched. Altitude, once merely a number on an altimeter, had become the border between two worlds, one ruled by exhaustion and gravity, the other by turbochargers and industry. And for those who tried to bridge it, the climb never ended. Operation Matterhorn was conceived in Washington with the sweep of a grand promise, a transcontinental air offensive that would lift the war across oceans and mountain ranges, striking Japan from bases in India and China months before the Pacific Islands were ready. It was, as the air staff called it, a strategic bridge proof that the B-29 Superfortress could deliver global reach. In the bright optimism of late 1943, no one yet knew how fragile that bridge would be. By the summer of 1944, the XX Bomber Command had turned airfields across eastern India and western China into stepping stones for the new weapon. Calcutta's Kharagpur, Piardoba, and Chakulia in Bengal served as staging and maintenance hubs. Forward bases at Chengdu, Qinglai, Hasinqing, and Pengshan became the launch pads for missions to the home islands. Every gallon of fuel, every bomb, every box spare parts had to cross the hump, the perilous Himalayan air corridor before reaching China. It took 12 gallons flown from India to deliver 1 gallon usable for combat in China. The mathematics of logistics bled the operation long before the enemy's guns did. Still, Matterhorn's opening months embodied audacity. After Yawata came further raids on Manchurian and Formosan targets, on Palembang oil refineries, and even Bangkok's rail yards. Each mission was a test of endurance. 12 to 14-hour flights at altitudes brushing 30,000 feet, crews wearing heated suits and oxygen masks that sometimes froze with condensation. At debriefings, the men spoke of exhaustion more than fear. The real enemy was distance. "We burned fuel to carry fuel," one navigator remarked dryly. "Every time we climbed, we were bombing our own range." American engineers had designed the B-29 to dominate high air, but China offered little room for error. The Chengdu runways were built by hand, their crushed stone surfaces flaking beneath the weight of 60-ton bombers. Each takeoff scattered rocks into propellers, each landing risked tire bursts. Yet morale remained high, because these were the first attacks on Japan since Doolittle's audacious raid of 1942. The press hailed them as the beginning of a second Tokyo fire. Reality proved slower. From the Japanese perspective, Matterhorn produced astonishment more than alarm. The high-altitude intrusions were infrequent and poorly concentrated. Only the first Yawata raid truly reached its target in strength. Later strikes hit Kyushu oil depots, Mukden aircraft factories, and steelworks at Anshan with limited effect. Japanese records show that of roughly 2,000 tons of bombs dropped on home island or Manchurian targets between June and December 1944, fewer than one-third fell within 1 mile of the aiming points. The jet stream, then a poorly understood meteorological phenomenon, shredded formation integrity and pushed bomb patterns miles off target. The very altitude that protected the B-29 seconds also robbed them of precision. The Norden bomb site, flawless in the calm of training ranges, became erratic in the thin turbulence over Asia. Bombs released at 30,000 feet drifted unpredictably. Smoke markers were invisible through haze. Photo reconnaissance showed many patterns scattered across empty countryside. When Brigadier General Kenneth Wolfe submitted his July mission report, he wrote candidly, "Damage negligible. Crews reported poor visibility and extreme winds aloft. Japanese interception ineffective, but accuracy unsatisfactory." Headquarters in Washington took notice. In response, General Curtis LeMay, then a 7-year-old firebrand with a reputation for ruthless efficiency, was assigned to replace Wolfe in August 1944. LeMay's arrival at Kharagpur marked the turning point of Matterhorn. He immediately imposed formation discipline, adjusted bombing altitudes to 27,000 feet to mitigate drift, and demanded rigorous engine maintenance to counter the R-3350's chronic overheating. Yet no tactical brilliance could fix the geography. The forward Chinese fields lay at the end of a supply line longer than any in history. By October, Japanese offensives in central China began closing in on the bomber bases themselves. One by one, the forward strips fell within artillery range, forcing evacuation of equipment that had cost months of labor to haul. The crews called it the Retreat of the Flying Mountains. In December 1944, the last B-29 seconds withdrew westward. Their missions shifted from Japanese soil to Southeast Asian targets, the Singapore Naval Base, Bangkok, and the Mandalay rail yards. Matterhorn had demonstrated that the B-29 could strike Japan, but only at unsustainable cost. Its grand lesson was not about courage or machinery, it was about logistics. To fight a strategic air war, one needed not just altitude but access. Post-war analyses by the U.S. strategic bombing survey confirmed what airmen already knew. Of all B-29 sorties flown under Matterhorn, only a small fraction achieved significant damage on strategic targets. Fuel consumption exceeded output by ratios approaching 12-1. Aircraft availability rarely exceeded 60%. And yet, even in failure, Matterhorn yielded data that would reshape the Pacific War. Crews gained experience in high-altitude navigation, formation tactics, and mechanical endurance. Maintenance crews learned to swap engines in field conditions. Planners learned to quantify weather's invisible enemy, the jet stream. When the Marianas were secured after the battles of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, LeMay and the XXI Bomber Command inherited the Matterhorn veterans. Their hard lessons rode west across the Pacific with them. From the new island bases, supply lines shortened by thousands of miles, runways stretched with proper concrete, and fuel flowed in abundance. The B-29 at last stood on solid ground. In retrospect, Matterhorn's story reads as prelude and proof of concept, an experiment written in distance and altitude, where the enemy's weakness and the attacker's limits were both exposed. For Japan, the campaign's raids, sporadic, high, and mostly harmless, were an ominous glimpse of what was to come when those same bombers operated from the Marianas without range constraints. For America, the operation taught that altitude alone was not victory. Only when logistics met geography would the Superfortress truly earn its name. By the end of 1944, the experiment had run its course. The fields at Chengdu were silent, their pierced steel planking half buried under dust. The very heavy bombers that once rose from their runways now assembled thousands of miles east, ready to fly from Guam and Tinian directly over the heart of Japan. The lessons of Matterhorn that distance could be a deadlier enemy than flak, that height could protect but not destroy, would soon shape the next phase of the war. The B-29 seconds had found their altitude. Now they would find their purpose. By November 1944, Japan's skies had changed color. The old blue horizon of fighter duels and anti-ship sorties was gone, replaced by the faint white streaks of B-29 contrails, thin threads stretching east to west, drawn 30,000 feet above the homeland. From those new Marianas bases, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the XXI Bomber Command under Curtis LeMay began the systematic assault that Matterhorn had only hinted at. The transformation was immediate and immense. What had been isolated pinpricks from China became daily invasions from across the Pacific. At their new island airfields, engineers laid 8,500-foot concrete runways that could bear the 40-ton bombers. Fuel arrived through pipelines and tankers. Bombs stacked by the tens of thousands waited on coral aprons. Unlike the hand-built fields of Chengdu, the Marianas were logistical fortresses, each a self-contained city of steel, aviation, gasoline, and endless replacement parts. When the first formations roared off Saipan in late November 1944, the Japanese radar operators at Choshi and Iwo Jima tracked them with disbelief. The scope showed entire grids of contacts, dozens of aircraft climbing to 31,000 feet, forming geometric patterns that looked more like weather fronts than raids. These were the first daylight strikes against Tokyo since Doolittle's 16 Mitchells, but this time the threat was industrial and permanent. At 12:30 p.m. on November 24, 111 B-29 seconds from the 73rd Bomb Wing approached the capital. In the sunlight, their aluminum skins glinted like fish scales. Contrails stretched for miles behind them. Below, the 10th Air Division scrambled every available interceptor Ki-44 seconds, Ki-61 seconds, J-2Ms, and a handful of Navy Zeros. The climb began as always, steep, desperate, and futile. The highest Japanese interceptors barely reached 31,000 feet before the formations turned away, bombs already falling. From the ground, the raid seemed almost abstract. Tokyo's anti-aircraft guns fired mechanically, bursts blooming thousands of feet below the bombers. Observers described the sound of distant thunder rolling across the city. The B-29 seconds themselves were faint dots, unmoving in the clear sky. Then came the low hum of bombs, first a whisper, then the heavy concussion of explosions marching through the Nakajima aircraft plant at Musashino. Only one B-29 failed to return that day, shot down by flak near Tokyo Bay. American crews called the mission a success. Japanese officers called it a warning. They fly where no fighter can follow, a report from the Army Air Technical Bureau noted. We must strike them before they climb. The phrase became doctrine. Intercept on ascent. In the following weeks, new radar stations along the coast tried to cue interceptors earlier, directing them toward the bombers' approach routes over Izu and Sagami Bay. Yet, even when fighters reached attack height in time, they met defensive fire of a kind never before seen. The B-29's remote-controlled turrets, each guided by gyroscopic sighting systems, created interlocking zones of .50 caliber fire, accurate even at night. Gunners trained on moving lights below rather than silhouettes. Radar-aimed tail guns tracked targets in total darkness. Captain Tadamichi Akamatsu of the 302nd Kokutai, a Navy ace from the Solomons, led one of the first daylight intercepts. His after-action note, later recovered from Yokosuka, captured the shock. At 9,000 meters, I opened fire from astern. Their tracers reached me before mine touched them. The air was full of bullets, though I could not see their guns. It was like fighting ghosts. Akamatsu's aircraft limped home with control cables shredded. He never again closed within 300 meters of a B-29. For Tokyo's defenders, each raid became a grim equation. The radar network provided roughly 30 minutes warning. A Ki-44 needed 25 minutes to reach 30,000 feet. Even a few minutes of climb delay doomed the intercept. Fuel shortages made things worse. Many fighters launched with half tanks, limiting engagement to 5 or 10 minutes. Every scramble risked losing aircraft to engine failure before combat even began. Meanwhile, the Americans refined their rhythm. B-29 groups attacked in waves of 100 or more, their formations tightened by new radar navigation systems. LeMay ordered bomb runs at 27,000 feet to improve accuracy while keeping above effective interception altitude. The result was paradoxical. Losses from flak and fighters remained under 1%, but bombing accuracy stayed poor. The jet stream now measured at up to 200 miles per hour, still scattered bomb patterns across the city. Yet the strategic effect was undeniable. Factories closed, rail lines twisted, and morale frayed. The Japanese press, bound by censorship, called the attacks large-scale air disturbances. Civilians simply called them B-san, Mr. B. To most Tokyo residents, the bombers were unseen but omnipresent, a distant rumble above clouds, followed by hours of smoke. The defenders' desperation deepened. In December, the army authorized the use of air-to-air rockets and ramming tactics near Osaka and Nagoya. Few succeeded. The 244th Sentai's ace, Major Teruhiko Kobayashi, downed one B-29 by head-on attack and lived. Most of his comrades died attempting the same. On the ground, anti-aircraft commanders pleaded for proximity fuses technology Japan lacked. Their best shells still exploded hundreds of meters below the formations. By January 1945, the pattern was set. Day after day of high-altitude raids, each met by frantic climbs and falling morale. The Japanese Defense Command measured success not in bombers destroyed, but in whether interceptors returned at all. The war diary of the 6th Air Division recorded on January 9. Enemy formations altitude 9,500 meters. Our fighters altitude 8,200 meters. Contact impossible. Returned due fuel shortage. Above them, the B-29 seconds remained untouchable, their contrails slicing west to east, brilliant against the winter sky. For the men below, they were both enemy and phenomenon proof that industrial power could command even the upper air. Over Tokyo, altitude had become destiny. The first months of 1945 were supposed to prove Japan could still defend its skies. Instead, they proved that altitude was not the only terror the Superfortress could command. The B-29 had already dominated the stratosphere. Now Curtis LeMay would teach it to rule the night. By February, the high-altitude precision raids over Tokyo and Nagoya had yielded little beyond exhaust and frustration. Jet streams of 150 to 200 miles per hour turned bomb patterns into scatterplots. Aiming points vanished in haze and cloud. After each mission, LeMay's intelligence officers presented photos that looked like winter farmland smoke, not targets. Only a handful of factories, like the Musashino engine plant, showed consistent damage. The B-29 could fly higher than any enemy, but it could not hit what it could not see. LeMay studied the problem with the same ruthless practicality that had made him feared since Europe. If altitude was protection but precision's enemy, perhaps the answer was to abandon both. Analysts from the 73rd Bomb Wing calculated that Japan's cities dense with wood, bamboo, and paper could burn more easily than they could be bombed accurately. Reports from the Strategic Bombing Survey in Europe confirmed that fire, not fragmentation, crippled morale and production. Thus was born the plan for Operation Meeting House, a low-altitude incendiary raid that would erase the line between industrial and civilian Japan. On the night of the 9th of March 1945, 334 B-29 seconds lifted off from Saipan, Guam, and Tinian. They flew without formation lights, at altitudes of only 5,000 to 7,000 feet, barely above the range of light flak. The bomb bays carried no high explosives this time, only clusters of M69 incendiaries, thin cylinders filled with napalm that would ignite 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit firestorms on impact. For crews accustomed to the thin air at 30,000 feet, the low-level run felt like diving into hell. Turbulence shook the unpressurized cabins. Oxygen masks hung unused. Yet radar guidance and calm weather promised accuracy unlike any mission before. At 12:08 a.m., the first Pathfinder aircraft, Little Joe, dropped marker flares over Tokyo's eastern industrial wards. The city lay dry from winter winds, its canals half empty, its wooden tenements stacked roof to roof. Within minutes, the first wave dropped 1,665 tons of incendiaries. The second and third waves followed in overlapping grids, each bomber releasing 10 tons per pass. Crews looking back described the city, igniting as if struck by sunrise, entire districts glowing orange, rivers reflecting sheets of flame. Below, chaos defied description. Fire lines leapt across blocks faster than people could run. The temperature on the ground reached 1,000 degrees Celsius. Asphalt boiled, canals burned, oxygen vanished. The Tokyo Fire Department logged 1,665 separate blazes before its radio network collapsed. Survivors recalled the sound as a single endless roar, the sky itself burning. At 2:37 a.m., radar aboard the final wave registered the heat bloom of a firestorm 20 miles wide. Pilots saw columns of smoke rising past 20,000 feet, turbulence tossing the heavy bombers like leaves. Gunners threw out ammunition belts to lighten weight, the heat singed paint from fuselages. Crews returning to Saipan could smell the burning city through their oxygen lines. By dawn, 16 square miles of Tokyo were gone, an area larger than all of downtown Manhattan. Between 80,000 and 100,000 people lay dead, more than in either Hiroshima or Nagasaki months later. Japanese reports counted 267,000 buildings destroyed. The Nakajima engine works, LeMay's original target, vanished along with everything around it. For the Japanese pilots waiting at Chofu and Yokosuka airfields, the night raid was a nightmare beyond interception. Their altimeters were useless. The bombers came in below them. Searchlights spun across smoke too thick to see through. When the 302nd Kokutai launched its few surviving J-2M Raidens, they found only turbulence and glowing clouds. Lieutenant Saburo Toyoda's log recorded a single line, "Cannot fight fire." The following morning, the Army Air Staff in Tokyo sent a terse telegram to the War Ministry. Enemy attack burned capital. Defense impossible under current conditions. The phrase "defense impossible" became code throughout the remaining months of the war. LeMay, reviewing mission footage on Tinian, showed no triumph. "We'll keep doing it," he said, "until they quit." His crews, stunned by what they had seen, named it "The Night the Sky Fell." The raid's success confirmed the new strategy: abandon precision, embrace annihilation. In the months that followed, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and dozens of smaller cities would meet the same fate. For Japan's surviving airmen, the fire raids destroyed what little hope altitude had offered. The B-29 no longer needed to hide in the stratosphere. It ruled the lower sky with equal impunity. Its speed, armor, and defensive guns made interception suicidal even at 5,000 feet. The 244th Sentai, once proud defenders of Tokyo, lost 30 aircraft in a single week. The 10th Air Division's April summary read like an obituary. Fighter losses unsustainable. Night intercept impossible. Flak insufficient. Morale critical. From the ground, civilians learned to read the sky differently. Contrails no longer meant distant raids. Now, the black smoke itself was the contrail. Children pointed upward and said, "Bisan is coming," even when the bombers were hours away. The air itself had become enemy territory. In the aftermath, both sides understood that something irreversible had happened. For Japan, the Jap illusion of defending its skies had ended. For America, the B-29 had fulfilled its grim promise, a machine so powerful it could reach any target, at any altitude, day or night. The thunder that once belonged to the stratosphere now roared just above the rooftops. And for those who watched Tokyo burn from the darkness below, the meaning of air power had changed forever. By the spring of 1945, Japan's air defense system existed largely on paper, while the B-29 ruled the sky as both spear and symbol. Yet even in their ruins, the Japanese defenders continued to fight a physics they could no longer defy. The story of those final months was not one of battles won or lost in the usual sense. It was a contest between gravity, altitude, and exhaustion. After the firestorm of Tokyo, the B-29 seconds struck like clockwork. Night after night, cities vanished under incendiary carpets: Nagoya on March 11, Osaka on March 13, Kobe on March 17. The maps of Japan began to change shape, their coastal lights replaced by burn scars, visible even to reconnaissance crews at 35,000 feet. For American pilots, each mission blurred into routine: throttle up, climb into thin air, line up on radar, and release. But for those in Japan, every contrail was an omen. The Imperial General Headquarters, desperate for results, ordered an absolute air defense zone around Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. All surviving interceptors were to be concentrated in these regions, yet the term defense had become a formality. Radar screens still tracked the incoming waves, but the response was predictable: slow climbs, oxygen failures, gun jams, and radio silence. Only a handful of aircraft ever reached engagement range. In April 1945, the Air General Army attempted a symbolic resurgence with a new weapon, the Ki-64 Hien, the best fighter Japan ever built. Fast, heavily armed, and with a ceiling near 39,000 feet, it seemed the long-awaited answer to the B-29, but reality intervened. The advanced Homar engine demanded high-octane fuel Japan could no longer produce. In the field, most Hayates barely reached 30,000 feet before engine temperatures soared into the red. Mechanics used fuel filtered from captured American drums, or mixed with alcohol. The engines seized after hours of flight. Still, a few exceptional pilots proved the design's potential. On April 19, Captain Kuro's 22nd Sentai caught a returning formation of B-29 seconds over Kyushu. Climbing from below, they managed to close within firing distance. 2 bombers fell, torn apart by 20mm cannon fire, the first confirmed victories in weeks. The radio messages spread through the network like a miracle. Enemy burning, altitude 9,000 meters, success. But the next raid came, and the next, and the miracle did not repeat. Meanwhile, the Americans had refined their campaign into a mechanism of annihilation. LeMay's XXI Bomber Command operated from the Marianas like an assembly line. Aircraft maintenance, fueling, and bomb loading ran 24 hours a day under floodlights. Ground crews timed each operation with stopwatches: 1 hour to refuel, 45 minutes to arm, 30 to pre-flight. The tempo defied imagination. 1,000 B-29 seconds could now take off within 3 hours. Between March and August 1945, they dropped 160,000 tons of bombs, more than twice what all Allied bombers had dropped on Germany in 1942. For the Japanese Fighter Command, the statistics were meaningless. They were living minute to minute. Ammunition was rationed to conserve resources, often 10 or 20 rounds per gun. Pilots practiced ramming tactics using obsolete trainers. The 47th Shinten Seikutai unit near Tachikawa trained daily for Tayatari, suicide interceptions. Their briefing posters bore the slogan, "Better to die at altitude than to live in fire." Most never reached either. Their engines failed long before they met the enemy. From the surviving flight logs, a pattern emerges, a kind of tragic geometry. At 7,000 meters, engaged but too low. At 8,000 meters, engine overheating. At 9,000 meters, target above cloud. At 10,000 meters, no contact. These were not combat reports but epitaphs of altitude. For the B-29 crews, the air war had become paradoxical. They faced less opposition than ever, yet their missions were deadlier in moral weight. Many had witnessed Tokyo, Kobe, and Nagoya burning beneath them. Few spoke about it. One pilot wrote home, "It's like looking down at the surface of the sun." The victories felt mathematical, detached. Precision had been replaced by power. The crew of Boxcar on Guam joked grimly that the war was now an exercise in gravity. By May, the last remnants of Japan's fighter strength gathered at Kyushu to defend the southern approaches. American reconnaissance flights reported barely 300 operational aircraft remaining. Most were grounded for lack of parts. The few that flew faced overwhelming odds. Radar-directed P-51 Mustangs now escorted the bombers from Iwo Jima, diving on any interceptor that dared climb. The Japanese pilots, once masters of the air over China and the Pacific, now fought in a three-dimensional trap: P-51 seconds from below, flak from below that, and the B-29 seconds far above. Yet they flew. Lieutenant Saburo Toyoda, who had once written "Cannot Fight Fire," led a final sortie on May 25 during the last great Tokyo fire raid. His group of 8 Raidens climbed into dawn light. None returned. When search teams reached the wreckage, Toyoda's aircraft was found intact except for a missing right wing. His guns had fired all ammunition. One shell casing remained jammed in the feed belt. As spring gave way to summer, Japan's air defense effectively ceased. Fuel depots were gone, runways cratered, radar stations silent. Yet the B-29 seconds kept flying higher, faster, farther. The new silver plate bombers, stripped of armor to carry nuclear payloads, arrived in Tinian under tight secrecy. Their pilots trained at altitudes. No interceptor could reach 31,000 to 33,000 feet, preparing for a mission that would render all others meaningless. In late July, the 20th Air Force briefed its crews for the final phase: destruction of the last 60 Japanese cities. The phrase "strategic target" had lost its distinction. Every square mile of Japan was now a grid to be erased. The very altitude that once symbolized technological triumph now framed something darker: domination without resistance. For the Japanese survivors, the contrails still marked the ceiling of the world unreachable, invincible. On the ground, children drew them in schoolyards before the buildings burned. "Those are the Bisan," one teacher wrote in her diary. "They live where air becomes heaven." When the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima on the 6th of August 1945, the single aircraft that delivered it, Enola Gay, flew at 31,000 feet. No fighters rose to meet it. There were no radars left to track it, no fuel to chase it, no pilots trained to fight above the clouds. The last defenders of the empire watched from the ruins as the white trail arced across the sky, one more line in the same endless pattern, and vanished into light. Altitude had defined the war's beginning and its end. For the B-29, it was both armor and destiny. For Japan, it was the unreachable summit that marked the boundary between survival and annihilation, the true ceiling of the world. The war ended, as so many had foreseen but few could admit, not with a final battle in the sky, but with a silence. When the Emperor's voice came through the static on the 15th of August 1945, Japan's surviving pilots listened from airfields that no longer had aircraft, from bunkers where engines lay cold. Overhead, the sky was clear, and for the first time in years, empty. The contrails that had once crisscrossed Japan's horizon, those pale threads of doom, were gone, yet their ghosts lingered, drawn into memory like vapor into blue. At Iwo Jima, the P-51 seconds stood lined along coral runways, their missions cancelled. At Tinian, where the B-29 seconds had launched the Fire and the Final Thunder, ground crews halted in mid-routine, bomb trucks parked under palm trees. The war's greatest air armada, thousands of superfortresses capable of reaching anywhere on Earth, now idled in perfect order, engines silent, propellers still. For General Curtis LeMay, the architect of destruction, the end was anticlimax. He walked the flight lines at North Field that morning, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the wings of the aircraft that had burned a nation. To one correspondent, he said simply, "They've had enough." His staff recorded no victory celebration. The B-29 crews, hardened by months of missions, spent the day sleeping through tropical heat or writing letters home. For them, the silence of peace felt unnatural, the absence of the endless drumming engines, the missing hum that had filled every moment of their waking lives. In Japan, the silence meant something different. It was the quiet of exhaustion, of surrender not just in war but in breath. The once proud fighter airfields at Chofu, Yokosuka, and Tachikawa had become graveyards of twisted metal. Pilots who survived their final sorties wandered among wrecks that had once been their comrades. Lieutenant Kenji Okabe, one of the last Raiden pilots to fly against B-29 seconds, wrote in his diary, "The sky is clear now. I can hear the wind again, but I do not know if it forgives us." In the ruins of Tokyo, civilians emerged from the ashes to a landscape that seemed carved by gods. 16 square miles of city had become an open plain of cinders, yet even there, among the ruins, the memory of altitude persisted. Survivors pointed upward when recalling the firestorm, describing the bombers as stars that moved. For many, the B-29 was less a machine than a force of nature, not enemy, not man, but sky itself. American occupation troops, arriving in September, found the myth of the Superfortress already woven into Japanese culture. Children drew its distinctive shape in chalk. Merchants sold toys modelled after it. Old soldiers spoke of its hum as a sound they could never forget. A Japanese intelligence officer, interviewed by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, put it succinctly. "When the B-29 came, we understood the war was lost, not because of one raid, but because it came from a place we could not reach." That altitude, the thin stratospheric world the B-29 had made its own, became the war's most enduring symbol. Engineers at Tachikawa, now working under American supervision, examined the wreckage of downed superfortresses and discovered marvels of design: turbo superchargers, pressurized cabins, precision instruments milled to tolerances impossible under Japan's wartime industry. The difference was not merely technical, it was philosophical. The B-29 was built for endurance, not sacrifice. Japan's fighters had been built for courage. In December 1945, at Atsugi Airfield, American officers invited former Japanese aces to inspect one of the captured B-29 seconds that had landed intact. They climbed the ladder silently, running their hands over the smooth aluminum skin. One pilot, Saburo Toyoda's surviving wingman, remarked softly, "We called it the mountain. Now I see why. You don't fight a mountain you climb until you die." The aircraft that had once been instruments of annihilation now became ambassadors of a new world. Some were repainted in white and red, carrying relief supplies across Asia. Others were dismantled and studied, their engines used to power the first post-war transports of Japan's reborn aviation industry. The same turbines that had leveled cities would later lift food and medicine to them. For the airmen on both sides, the transition from war to peace was a descent from altitude to gravity, from noise to stillness. Major Robert Morgan, who had flown B-17 seconds in Europe and later B-29 seconds over Japan, recalled that final landing at Tinian. "We shut down the engines and listened. It was so quiet, you could hear the sea. I realized I'd never really heard silence before. In the years that followed, that silence filled with memory. The U.S. Air Force, born from the ashes of the Army Air Forces, would carry the B-29's lineage into the jet age. The Japanese pilots who had once climbed toward its contrails now trained under its former enemies, building a new air self-defense force under the same sky. Yet the old respect endured when Japanese and American veterans met at a 1985 reunion in Hawaii. They raised a toast not to victory or defeat but to altitude. "It was the thin air that decided everything," said General Adolf Galland, the visiting German guest, recalling his own words about the Thunderbolt. "Up there, courage means nothing without machinery. Down here, machinery means nothing without memory." As twilight fell over Pearl Harbor that evening, a single preserved B-29 made a ceremonial flyover, its engines echoing faintly through the humid air. Those who looked up saw not a weapon but a relic, the last ghost of the war's highest warplane, circling in the quiet sky it had once owned. For the men who had fought beneath or inside it, that sound carried both pride and penance. The B-29 had begun as an experiment in altitude and ended as an instrument of total war. It had turned the upper atmosphere into a battlefield and left the world beneath, forever changed. And so, when the engines faded and the silence returned, the meaning of flight itself had altered. The sky was no longer only freedom or fear, it was memory. Thin, distant, and eternal. The quiet above,